All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm here today. I invited Serious Duffer back. We are going to discuss a topic that has come up recently. If you've been watching any Jordan Peterson, and then also I've had a little bit of discussion today on my Facebook wall with some friends, which is how do we know when the left or the right has gone too far? Um, I'll kind of give a preface to it in a minute, but first, want to say hi to Serious Duffer. Um, Go ahead, Duffer.
Hey, JP. Thank you for inviting me back. I'm looking forward to discussing this topic. It's rife with things that could get us both in trouble, but it's also a topic which is going to be nice to pick apart and sort of drill down into, because as we're going to see, when it comes to defining things like ethno-nationalism versus things like civic nationalism, there's a lot of gray areas, and there's a lot of opportunities for people to opt into one of these categories or opt out of them while still being in those categories operationally. So it's like, whoa, how do you get out of these? There's such broad terms, right? But yeah, looking forward to it there, JP.
Well, thanks. And I don't know if you want to give any background about yourself, because I can at least say we're not from the same country. So some of our, if we get into any kind of legality stuff, we have to assume, I'm from the U.S., but you're not. So I don't know. I guess we can kind of bring that up as if it becomes relevant. But as far as the, whether or not the left or the right has gone too far, this came up, at least the first time I heard Peterson bring it up was during the Monk debate, when it was him and Stephen Fry debating Michael Eric Dyson, and I believe her name was Michelle Goldberg. And one of the questions that Peterson posed, well, first he posited the following. He said, we know when the right goes too far. And he says the right's gone too far when they start talking about, and I want to make sure I got this right, ethnic superiority or racial superiority. But when is the left gone too far? And he kind of posed that question, and the obvious answer was, well, when they're violent. But Peterson didn't really accept that answer, because he says, well, you could say that about either side. Violence is obviously too far. But before violence on the right, he was saying that racial superiority, or I guess ethnic superiority, I don't remember the exact term, but I know I was corrected earlier on my Facebook wall. But that the superiority was kind of like the indicator that they've gone too far. And they never got a real answer from Michelle or Michael Eric Dyson during that interview, during that debate. But during a recent interview with Peterson, he said that he believes the left's gone too far when they start talking about equality of outcome, right? So, and I'm willing to accept that, because I think you might too have an idea of how touting equality of outcome can be an indicator of what's to come next. I don't know if you want to some of that a little bit with your views.
Well, with that, I think it's not just touting, but touting the enforcement of equality of outcome,
right,
and framing it in a positive light. Like, if everybody earns this much, the world will be better. If everybody has access to this particular service all the time, the world will be better. And if anyone happens to be better at their job or worse at their job, and the better person actually gets incentivized in some way that the worst person does not, then that is seen as a bad thing, because it influences the equality of outcome. So it's talking in a way that says it's better to have equality of outcome because everything else is unacceptable. And as soon as you remove the ability to talk about other outcomes, I would say that is the big issue. Not just touting it, but touting that you cannot question that equality of outcome is the best possible outcome.
Yeah, so let's spend some time there, because that's a distinction I made in the chat I had today, which was, sorry, my mind is like, whoa, today. But that basically, obviously, we could talk about anything. We should be able to entertain all kinds of ideas, including equality of outcome. But to me, there's a difference between talking about the validity of equality of outcome, Marxist ideas, communist ideas, etc., and actually, as you said, saying, well, that's how things should be, and I'm going to start making the changes to make sure it happens, right? Because to me, you've gone from the intellectual kind of poking and prodding and running thought experiments to say what would happen if we did this, to we're going to go make policy, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think there's something in between, which is, if you want to practice that on your own, that's fine. So, for example, I take it you make a lot of money, serious, and
I wish. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but you make some amount of money, and you certainly make more money than some people. So, if you took it upon yourself to take the money you earned and share it with others, I would have zero issue with it, right? Because you're making that choice. Where I take issue is where, and again, it goes to what you said, is when you start insisting I must do the same, that I have to share everything that I earn such that there is equality of outcome. Would you agree with that, or do you think there's a finer way to distinguish between?
Yeah, I think it really boils down to what are the expectations that society and other individuals have about what you do with your assets, whether they be monetary or something else. And if the expectation is that other people can dictate what you do, and it's in fact wrong of you to try and make any sort of personal choice with how you allocate your resources, then that is a really horrible version of equality of outcome that is very totalitarian in its perspective. Because it's not just that we're going to dictate how much you earn, we're going to dictate what you do with what you have, but if you deviate in any way, we will punish you because you have, besmirched the perfect system. So taking away people's agency with regards to what they earn or how they go about trying to earn something is one of the very dark parts of the argument for equality of outcome.
Yeah, and so by the way, Stan just came in. So hi, Stan. I made you a moderator. I know you're good at that stuff. So anybody did come in and started calling us Nazis, you can do what you wish and block them. But yeah. So to your point, so the loss of agency. That's kind of the point I was making in the chat that I had earlier, which is there's almost three categories. There's the intellectual discussion of it on like what it would mean if we implemented equal outcome. Then there's the personal choice of it, where you start sharing your earnings because you think it's the right thing to do. But then there's forcing others to do it. And I think what you called, the loss of agency is the same as force, right?
Mm. Sure.
Would that be fair, or
yeah. So loss of agency, meaning that there is something outside of yourself which is dictating what you can do. So that would be forcing others. And yeah, we could put loss of agency in there as well.
Cool. So, because that's how I understand, and that's why I think the left has gone too far when they start seriously touting the idea of equal outcome, where they actually want to implement it. And as you said, they think it's the only way. Like there is no other way. That's how things should be. And it's like, okay, well, if you're thinking about that, then we've messed up somewhere, right? So now on the right, Peterson said ethnic superiority or racial superiority. And I kept saying, but I don't know if I quite agree with that. So part of the discussion that happened earlier was a distinction between ethnic or racial superiority and ethnic or racial nationalism, right? And we could pick one. Like you said, we were talking about it a little earlier. Ethnicity is such a broad term, right?
Yeah. And what I'd sort of point to that to help frame our discussion is if we go over to, I forget what the site is, msu.edu, but it's a university site. And they quote a guy named Michael Ignatieff, who used to be a member of the Canadian Parliament and the head of the Liberal Party. And one of the things he does is try to tease the ethno-nationalists apart from civic nationalists. And I'm going to read you the two definitions and how he sort of broadly frames them. And what you're going to see is that despite these being treated as two separate things, there's so much overlap in terms of the wording that it's hard for any type of nationalism not to fit within either the ethno or the civic or both at the same time. So in terms of ethno-nationalism, the way he puts it together is this, is that in an ethno-nationalist ideology, nationhood is defined by language, region, custom, and traditions. According to ethno-nationalists, it's not the state that creates the nation, but the nation that creates the state. So the glue that holds people together is not shared political rights, but pre-existing ethnic characteristics. Now, here's the thing I want to problematize first. What do you mean by ethnic characteristics?
Right.
Because the thing is, ethnic groups are not easily defined by people looking from the outside in, or not necessarily easily recognized. But the example he would give in terms of ethno-nationalism is Germany during its unification wars. So what happened with this is that Germany had a romantic notion of itself and the German people, and that it appealed to the idea that different people can be rank ordered on a hierarchy of, in this case, European peoples, and that the people with the best philosophy, the best way of doing things, and the best character, both physically and morally, are the Germans. So it's basically saying there's something about Germanism that makes it the ideal thing to create a society around. And you go, okay, but the problem with that is if we actually look at Germany, then, we're talking in the 1900s, yeah, there are many different groups of Germans, and not all of them are the same. So it's like, as soon as you start trying to talk about ethno-nationalism, you're assuming a nationalism based off of superiority, based off of pre-existing conditions within the group, and the idea that your group has the best way of doing things.
Well, does so that's the part where I'm disconnected, because even with the confusion of what it actually means to be ethnically the same or whatever, right? If we put that aside and let's just assume people to some degree with some error feel that this is German or this is American or this is Anglo-Saxon, whatever, right? Does it mean that they are superior? Does it mean that they believe they're, just because you want ethnic nationalism, that doesn't mean you believe you're ethnically superior, is the point I'm making. And just because you think you're ethnically superior doesn't mean you want ethnic nationalism. Do you get what I'm saying?
The first part of that, within the terms of the definition, is contrary to what it assumes. So the assumption is that you automatically have an ethnic superiority complex.
If you want ethnic nationalism?
Yes.
So real quick, because to a point that I think, and if they're watching later, they can correct me, but a point I think somebody was making to me earlier was that the default state is ethnic nationalism. So all around the world and throughout history, most nations are ethno-nationalist, right? Like there's no, like China was China, like Chinese people, and France was French people, and you know what I mean? Like there was always ethno-nationalism. And that's another thing I'm having a hard time distinguishing from, because I understand that point. And it's like, the argument is that seems to work, and that mixing the ethnic groups seems to cause a lot of conflict. Fine. But now here's the thing. If you already have a mixed ethnic group, such as America, right? What does it mean to become an ethnic nationalist state again, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think to go in that direction would require force. But if you're just happen to be an ethnic, I hate these words, an ethno-nationalist state, I guess, is that a fair term?
So if you just so happen to be a state which can be defined as having ethno-nationalistic characteristics. Yeah.
Yes. If you like, I don't know if Norway is that, but let's say Norway is largely that, then keeping people out of your country isn't really quite the same thing, right? Because keeping people out is just a resistance, where if people are already in and you're kicking them out, that's a force. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's another thing I'm thinking about, is just like, Peterson brought up superiority, apparently, and so did people in this chat, as being the indicator of gone too far. And I brought up ethno-nationalism as the indicator have gone too far. And now I just feel like it's either one, whichever one comes first for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, although the terms wouldn't be completely synonymous, there's enough of a grayness between them that you kind of get the chicken and the egg argument. So it's like, does ethnic superiority predate ethno-nationalism? But here's the problem. As you pointed out rightly, ethno-nationalistic tendencies tend to be the starting point for all groups, or at least all groups that want to exist for a long period of time. But it's that way because it's easier to comprehend what's going on if you can limit the type of people that you're talking about, or the type of people that you think about when you refer to something. So, for example, if we're talking about Canadians, that's a very broad thing. But in most Canadians' heads, they have a picture of what it is to be Canadian, who makes up that composition. Now, there could be many different racial groups within that, and still have a global ethno-nationalist perspective on things, because you share certain characteristics about what you think society should be like. But that's so ridiculously broad that it becomes almost a useless categorization.
Right.
Because in reality, all you're doing is trying to find some heuristic to say, we are like this, other people are not. We like what we have, and people who are also in that category are generally better because we know more about them, and therefore we can have easier discussions with them about how the world is.
Yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts there, JP?
You know, I think that's why it's such a confusing question, is because there's so much ambiguity to the terms, and then there's interesting relationships between them. So I'm not so sure I get how it's a chicken or egg. I almost think it's a chicken or egg or dinosaur egg thing. And what I mean by that is, like, yes, sometimes it's a chicken or egg thing. Like, yes, ethno-nationalism can lead to or coexist with ethnic superiority, or racial. You know, when I use ethnic, you could also just replace the word with racial in your head for the same idea, almost. So if you want like a racially, what would you call that instead of an ethno state? What would a racial one be?
Let's say a racially homogenous state.
Yeah, if you want the racially homogenous state, I can see both how that would mean you think your race is superior and not. And Richard Spencer is a good example of this, because he is a white nationalist and he does want an ethno state, but he's on record saying he doesn't actually believe whites are superior, maybe in some ways, but not in others, right? He doesn't believe like in white superiority per se, at least no more than he believes in Asian superiority or black superiority. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and he's a tricky one, because I'm never quite sure how much to believe of how he parses out how he tries to categorize things.
Well, I believe that one because I understand it, right? I understand the idea, like, at least when you're talking about race. Now, I do believe he thinks that there's a culture involved with that race, and that culture is probably superior. But would that be ethnic superiority, but not race superiority? You know what I mean? Like, is cultural superiority a bad thing?
Now, you can also have cultural nationalists and kind of like civic nationalists as well, although people would say that cultural nationalists might be more extreme than civic nationalists. So I'll read you what it says about civic nationalism, and we can try and reverse engineer what cultural nationalism would look like from that. Okay. But so civic nationalism is nationhood defined by common citizenship. A civic nation consists of all those who subscribe to its political creed, regardless of ethnicity, race, color, religion, or language. So it's saying that there's a state out there and there's a body of laws and a body of legal reasoning that people will accept. Now, the principle is that the community, or those within the community, have equal rights because they're citizens. They have a patriotic attachment to their to their nation, and they have a shared set of political values that they will enforce, or at least try to ascribe to, even when it might not be in their best interest. And it vests all sovereignty in the people. So slightly different, but what's so funny about that is, okay, so that's civic nationalism, but if your culture espouses all these things and you're culturally nationalistic, what would the difference be?
Right. It sounds like the only difference then, this idea of this hypothetical idea in my head of cultural nationalism and civic nationalism would be that you're a citizen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that came up in the discussion as well. And they said, because I was saying, look, I think it's reasonable that countries vet people who want to migrate to them. So America can vet people who want to come in. And if they don't agree, if the people, all you're checking for is to see to what degree do these people, does the migrant have the will to assimilate to your culture? But I kind of like what you're saying with civics, because you can almost think of our Constitution and our laws as that. So you're saying, are you willing to obey our Constitution and our laws? Mm-hmm. See, I don't know then, because in America, for example, our Constitution and laws are pretty broad intentionally, and they optimize for freedoms, right? They optimize for liberty. So there's nothing about our law that says you can't be like a practicing Muslim. However, a practicing Muslim is going to be culturally very different than our typical Christian, right? So there's a case where civically you would be under the same laws and you would be okay with those laws, but culturally you'd be very different, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so essentially civic nationalism just presupposes that if you wish to become part of, let's say, a country or a nation, that you accept their legal reasoning and, let's say, their common law. So that is, how do you go about doing things? How do you go about electing officials? That having the system which you have is good, and you're not supposed to work against it just because it might not optimize everything to the way you would prefer it to be, so long as everybody within that legal reasoning and under those laws are treated equally before them.
Now, would you say civil or cultural nationalism would be too far?
Now, depending on the groups we're talking about and the nations we are talking about, both can be too far. And the way this is parsed is assuming that in both cases, you have a democratic system that once you become a citizen, you have equal rights before the law compared to, and it doesn't matter what your background is. Right. But let's assume that civic nationalism and cultural nationalism are based off systems that are not democratic and not equal in their interpretation. Of course, you can go too far, especially if, so let's take Malaysia for an example. In Malaysia, it's preferable to convert to Islam because under the law, you will be treated differently than people who are not. In fact, you would be incentivized to become part of a particular group. So if that's part of your civic nationalism, that we actually have a two-tier system in place, that is before the law, not necessarily just in practice, but actually within the written part of the law, that there is a two-tier system or a three-tier system, that would be actually be a pretty terrible thing. So in terms of that as cultural nationalism, if you assume that the incoming, in this case, Islamic cultural norm is better, and that everybody should ascribe to it because it is clearly better than anything else, and we don't really want a diversity of things, we want everybody to ascribe to this set of beliefs and this set of actions, then cultural nationalism and civic nationalism in both cases are not ideal states, because we're not talking about things which are inherently democratic.
Doesn't it depend on Wouldn't it depend on the content of your beliefs? Because I feel the American Constitution is designed in such a way that its beliefs are kind of meta, right? It's not telling you to be a Christian and have these values. It's not telling you. I mean, obviously, it touts some values, but the values they tout are at a different level of abstraction than what you see elsewhere, I feel. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So based off of, let's say, the concepts both outlined or left open-ended within what's written in the Constitution, there are some inherent things which the founding fathers would have liked people to be like. But within those confines, there's actually a lot of room for people to act and be part of different groups, so long as when they come together, they all agree upon the idea that there is common ground, and that in the case of the American system, we believe in checks and balances against the excesses of both government and the private sector, and let's say the public community as a whole. And that the idea that those balances are there to make sure that people are treated equally before the law, regardless or irregardless of where they come from or their particular belief system, is a good thing. And that everyone should believe that this equalness before the law is a good thing is built into the culture it's trying to promote.
Right. And beyond that, I feel many other set of values and ideas can exist within. What happens is if somebody describes to me a different model of their values and what's allowed, what's not allowed, and my system fully allows their system, but their system does not fully allow mine, I almost automatically regard my system as superior. Now, if I was met with something in the other way, in reverse, which I can't imagine one, where their system fully allowed mine, but mine didn't fully allow theirs, I would be inclined to adopt it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm looking for that highest tier where everybody is free to kind of pursue truth the way that works for them, if that makes sense. And what I like about America is all it does is it doesn't tell you how to, it doesn't tell you what to do at all. It just tells you, it doesn't even tell you what you can't do. It just tells you a very few things that the government is allowed to basically protect, right? Like if I try to do something that might hurt or kill you, well, then I waived my right to not be hurt or killed. And the government will come in and, using minimal force, ideally, they will prevent me from being able to infringe on your life and your freedoms, right? And it's like, that seems the most fair to me. I can't think of something more abstract than that allows everybody to be free agents, you know?
Okay. The way I'm thinking of it there, JP, is what you want is the system that allows or has the highest amount of efficacy for diversity of states of being. So you can have many people with many different beliefs, and they can all work within that system, provided that they don't have ulterior motives, or that they don't ascribe to an ideology that has ulterior motives. Right?
Well, so that's what I'm saying is the only thing they'd have to ascribe to is this very abstract thing that I think has actually been documented really well in America.
Mm-hmm.
You get what I'm saying? Like, if they subscribe to that, then they're free to make new religions, have different values, behave on their own how they want to behave, right? I'll distinguish a good Christian from a bad Christian. A good Christian generally does that, right? They use their beliefs to guide them, and they obviously will try to influence you, but they won't force you to behave differently. They say, leave that judgment to God, right? So I just feel like as long as they're, and that's why I'm wondering, is it civic? Is it cultural? But like, my view would be if they could subscribe to that level of freedom, then it doesn't matter what color they are, what religion they are, et cetera, what languages they speak. You know what I mean? And I don't know what that would fall under.
Yeah. So the thing is, that could relate to both ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism,
Right.
or just a certain type of nationalism, depending on the framework which you're talking about. And this is, I think, where the nuance starts to begin, because there are many different types of nationalism, many different types of cultural nationalism, or even just thoughts about how the world should be. So in your perspective, and also in my perspective, there are systems that allow for far greater freedom. And because of the freedom that they allow, while still providing a structure that tells you what you can and can't do, those are better than systems that have less freedom and are more prone to, let's say, punitive, corrective, or violent action to try and enforce what the society is supposed to be like.
Yeah, that poses an interesting question. Like, would you rather live in a society without freedoms, where the danger are the people in charge, or would you rather live in a society with freedoms where the danger are your peers? Right? I mean, more so than the people in charge.
And that's also sort of one of those tricky things, because depends on the group of people or the individuals we're talking about.
Right.
For me personally, I'd rather have to worry about other people and dealing with them rather than having to deal with a very authoritarian or dictatorial government. Because at least with other people, I can reason with them, hopefully one-on-one, or at least work with like-minded people under the same auspices of government and freedom. So you might get a group together that wants something, but I can also get a group together that wants something. And the government is not going to come down and arrest one group of us because we're more in line with what the government wants.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like, and this came up in the meetup the other day, it's about proximity and reach. The people around you, if you really aren't getting along, just move away from them. It's like worst case scenario, because their reach isn't that far. They're not going to go out of their way to ruin your life if you're in the next state. But government, they have a very, very, very far reach, it seems. It's like having a neighbor that you can't stand and you're willing to move away from, but you can't. You actually literally have to leave the country to get away from them.
Yeah. And once again, that also becomes more or less problematic depending on what is expected of the government and what leeway it is provided with. So in a very totalitarian state, or at least a very authoritatively minded state, the problem becomes that the government, as you've pointed out, can follow you wherever you go and can actually start cherry picking people who are preferable or non-preferable and use the mechanisms of the state to come down hard on them. And this doesn't actually have to be at a governmental level either. We can see it in terms of religious groups as well. So if we look at the Middle East right now, and we look at Syria, for example, we have a diaspora of a lot of different quote unquote ethnic groups because they aren't part of the right religious orientation, or they're not Arabs. So therefore they're less than people and they have to go, or they don't have the same rights, and the government is not willing to extend them those rights despite the fact that they are being treated very poorly. So we have examples of like Yazidi women under the Islamic State, right? And the large-scale murder of like Druze people and other things, because that ideology, or at least the ideology that they ascribe to, does not extend the same rights to those people, and the governance structure will reinforce that. And so you can't get away so long as you're in a region that has both that cultural orientation and that ideological orientation. So their version of civic nationalism would be tied to both and would actually reward the punishment and, you know, mistreatment of these lesser groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So going back to like, what's the indication of having gone too far then? Because I think people generally have the sense that Richard Spencer is going too far. His views have gone too far, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's been punched for his ideas.
Right. I mean, I don't agree with that. Well, that's another level too. So there's different lines here. I wonder what the line would be for me to punch somebody short of them actually being violent. I don't know if there is. I would have to have strong evidence, like very strong evidence, beyond any reasonable doubt that they were about to commit violence in order to be violent, I suppose. For example, if you were standing there with a bat, telling somebody I'm about to hit you over the head, probably don't have to wait for them to hit them over the head. You can go you can go stop them, right? But that's a different line. So this line is just an indication of having gone too far, because obviously if someone's standing with a baseball bat and threatening to hit somebody with it, we've missed a lot of other signs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a question of those signs. And I feel like if you ask somebody on the left this question, they might say, well, trying to have stricter borders is too far, right? They might suggest that. I don't think that's quite, for me, I don't think having stricter borders has gone too far. I think it's a bit further than that. And I think it has to do not with who we let in, but who we push out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So judging based off of, so if we go back and we're using Syria and a lot of the Middle Eastern regions, which are in a state of flux right now, you would have more of an issue with the fact that groups would go into other people's houses and wholesale round them up and force them out of the region just because they're members of those groups.
Yeah.
Then you would saying, here's our borders, we're not letting anyone in.
We're not letting anyone in who doesn't meet these criteria or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. There was actually an interview by the BBC with a member of the Hungarian parliament recently, where the BBC interviewer basically called the Hungarian guy racist and an ethnophobe.
Yeah, and wasn't he like? Didn't he say something like, "I'm going to respond to that insult"? Like you insulted him. Yeah, I saw this.
And that was actually, I think, a really neat thing for him to do, because it was an attack, right? It's essentially saying, and it's assuming a collectivist stance that the collective of the European Union and what they consider to be right or wrong is far superior than what an individual nation can do with its own borders. Right. And he was basically making the argument which you're saying, which was that when it comes to our country, who we let in and out is different than saying we're going to kick these people who are part of our country out, right? And you should not try and impugn our motives for keeping people out when you can't actually point to things within our nation that show that we are, let's say, adversarially inclined to people with similar backgrounds, but just so happen to be in our country, as opposed to those that are trying to come in, right? Yep. So there's a difference between saying, okay, this is a terrible example, and I hope no one takes this as a sound clip. There's a difference between saying, we hate all of these people. So historical example, people of Jewish descent. Mm-hmm. Versus saying, we're going to prevent this group from coming in at this point because we don't feel that we are well equipped to deal with things which they're going to bring into our nation. Now, that's not saying we hate them forever. What we're saying is, at this point, we don't feel well adjusted to do this.
Right. And for me personally, I would understand that. But for me personally, that's not the decision I would make wouldn't even be that. The decision I would make would be, especially in America, would just be like, okay, you're Muslim, for example, right? Because that's what Trump wanted to do, is have a freeze on at least Muslims from certain countries, right? Until it was all, actually, I think at one point he said we should stop all Muslims from coming in until we figure this out. But I would say, it's fine, you're Muslim. We just want we want to know that you care about American values and that you're moving here not to change America, but to be a part of something great, right? And I think of it like a relationship. You don't enter a relationship and then try to change the person, right? You enter a relationship to join the person, to help make the person better, and they can make you better, right? I think in the same way, if you're moving to a country, like there's no way in hell I'm going to move to the UK and then because I want to change it. That doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing
Well, I
there
mean, I
is,
could, but I don't expect them to be, oh yeah, sure, just come in and change everything we stand for. Go for it. Like I'm going to be met with resistance.
another terrible sound clip. It depends on what you're basing your discriminatory factors on. So, for example, the quote-unquote Muslim ban is perhaps too broad. It would have been a lot better to actually try and tease that out more. And we would literally say, we want to prevent people with Salafist perspectives or Wahhabist perspectives or extreme Deobandi perspectives from coming into our country because they are Islamicists, meaning they believe Islam is the best answer for everything. And they want to agitate to get rid of anything that is not an Islamic governance structure. And we feel that they would be basically double agents within our country trying to erode the systems which we have in place because they believe that one thing is better than all others, and therefore they're not honest actors within our system. And saying that and using historical examples as well, unfortunately, during the precursor to World War II, many Jewish people were trying to go into diaspora around the world, and some of them were trying to come to Canada and North America, and our governments were flat out saying, no, we just don't want you. And it's like, well, why don't you want to? Is it because you think that they're going to work against the government, that they're actually going to try and change your nation in a negative way that'll make it, let's say, different and possibly worse? Well, in that case, that wasn't the case at all. They just didn't want Jewish people to come in because they didn't want Jews. Jews were seen as an undesirable people simply for their state of being, not for the articulation of their beliefs. And that's the difference.
Well, so now that does beg the question of, you know, we often can feel something before we can articulate it. So it begs the question of, did they not want Jews because they felt what you said, that the Jews were going to undermine their, you know, I mean, that's basically what Nazi Germany was, right? They said that the Jews were undermining their way of being as German, right?
Yeah. And sadly, yeah, no, it comes down to, once again, the relative nuance of the lens that you're using. And
well, that's my problem. It's like, had Nazi Germany, here's a good question. Had Nazi Germany just decided we are not going to allow any new Jewish citizens because we believe that the Jewish value system is undermining the German way, and the German way is, I guess this is where the idea of superior would come in. But had they just decided, like, look, we have something good here, they're undermining it, we're just not going to let any new people in. The existing people, they're already citizens, so if they took a civil nationalist approach, and we can't kick them out, they are seen as equal under the law. And they promoted that, like, look, we get that they have different views than you, but they're equal under the law. You're not allowed to be an asshole. Well, you're not allowed to be an asshole to them, especially, any more than you can anyone else, right? And that was the path that they took, and they just refused entrance of new Jews. Would that have been, well, the question, would that have been better, is kind of a dumb question, because relatively speaking, it's like almost anything would have been better, right?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. The problem with that particular analogy is just the country which you're choosing. Better example, I think, would be, okay, so Turkey. Now, Turkey sadly committed genocide against the Kurdish peoples, the Armenian peoples, and the Armenians are actually somewhat Kurdish. But here's the thing. So Turkey already had a vested population of Armenians, Kurds, and other things. They were already there, and they were within the borders of Turkey when Turkey was construed. Now,
Right.
Turkey chose to agitate against the Armenians to such a degree that they were actually killing their own people and killing their own citizens,
Right.
while at the same time saying, we don't want any more either.
Right.
And because you're taking those two actions together, that becomes a type of ethno-nationalism and ethno-superiorism that falls into one of those categories of not ideal. So within our system, it would be very hard to justify exterminating people in your country and preventing people from coming in as being somehow a greater good.
Right. But I'm also, well, that's kind of what I'm noticing, is just that it doesn't seem so much the keeping people out thing. I mean, that does bother a lot of people on the left. I get that, because they believe that we should just have open borders and the globe should be our state. But to everyone else, it's not. To the majority of people in the world, I would say, because I don't think most people in the world are progressive like our progressives are. To the majority of people in the world, they don't seem as bothered by keeping people out as they do as kicking people out. So even in the Turkish situation, had they just stopped any Armenians and Kurdish from coming in, but treated the Armenians and Kurdish that were there as citizens, as the citizens that they are, they were citizens, right?
Yeah.
Then would that have been acceptable?
Yeah, and
too far.
The issue is always relative. So, is there a underlying bad intention, or do you have an ulterior motive? So, are you treating them nicely now because you're going to round them up in the future and kill them? That's a bad motive. That's an ulterior motive, right?
Well, that's what people think of Donald Trump, I think, is they think that somehow Trump trying to keep Mexicans out, at least the criminal ones, that somehow this is going to lead to him kicking Mexicans out. But I don't think Trump would ever call for kicking citizens out of America. If you're a citizen, you're a citizen. That's it. I don't think he cares about that at all.
Yeah. And that comes down to sort of, once again, your civic identity or your national identity and what you're willing to espouse and what the common practice tells you about how you treat your own people. And in the United States, common practice still dictates that if you're American, regardless of your heritage, you're treated as an American citizen. That people can sneak into America and take advantage of the fact that if you're born in the States, you're considered American, is a different thing. Because once again, those are bad actors. Whether or not what they try to do is justifiable because of how bad things are in their own country, to sneak in and try and make use of a legal loophole is acting in bad faith.
Yeah.
And so where the discussion seems to break down is that people more so on the left are unwilling to see sneaking into a place and taking advantages of a loophole as an example of bad acting.
Well, in their mind, they just don't think there should be you don't have to sneak into a park that has no fence, right? Is the way they see it.
But the flip side is there's many people who are, let's say, on the more extreme libertarian, in fact, let's say as far as anarchic end of the spectrum, who would say that if they find a loophole not to pay taxes, that's something which is commendable and you should be rewarded for, even though that's bad acting as well. And the justification for being able to be a bad actor within a system while still benefited from the system is the biggest problem.
Yeah, you're saying that there are people who, well, that's interesting. So there are conservatives that think working around the tax system is like the job, but working around the border system, it's like, wow, you're an asshole. Where there are liberals who think the complete opposite. Oh, you worked around the border system. It's like, yeah, because there shouldn't be one. That's interesting. But I think, there's the constant in both of those cases. The left thinks there shouldn't be a border, and the right thinks there shouldn't be taxes.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, so I think that they are excited that maybe not even excited is the word, but they're okay with people breaking the system because they don't believe that system should exist, or at least not to the degree it does.
Or they don't believe that the system is just on some level.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually where it's gone too far. Because if by any objective measure, even if your system is not perfect, but you compare it against other systems and it allows for greatest efficacy and greatest freedoms, and you claim that it is not just, even though it's probably the best thing which we have right now, that's where you start going too far, because you uncouple your criticism from reality, mostly based off of utopianism, the idea that there is a perfect state that was or that will be achieved. And so as soon as you start framing that things ought to be this way because it would be perfect if they are, you've gone too far.
Okay, see, that's what I was looking for. That I want something that would describe both of those things. Okay, so the left wants equal outcome. But see, okay, so here was something I brought up was equal outcome sounds like an end goal, right? Racial superiority doesn't sound like a goal at all. It just well, depends on how you frame it. If you want racial superiority, like you want your race to be superior, that's a goal, right? But if you just believe your race is superior, like I honestly don't give a shit. You know what I mean? You like black people believe it, white people, like a lot of there are people in pretty much every race that actually believe their race is superior. I don't have a problem with that as long as there's no goal attached to it, right? But when I brought that up and I said, well, one was a goal and the other one is just a belief, somebody said, yes, but the first one is a goal predicated on a belief. And the idea that we should have equal outcome, that's a goal, is predicated on the belief that equal outcome is the right way to structure things, right? But I still am disconnected because I don't feel like I see how the belief that equal outcome is a good measurement means you want people to have equal outcome, but I don't see how the belief that your race is superior automatically implies that you want like an ethno-state or something. I don't think that's clear at all.
Yeah. So just to chase that, so if you ever go to any Chinese boards talking about international news and things like that, by and large, you will have people espousing racially superior, framing their things in terms of both national superiority and racial superiority. And that's just something that you do because, of course, China's the best. And of course, the Chinese people are the best. We have the longest history. We have the best things. We're the most powerful economy in the world in their own perspective. This idea that that is a bad thing is somewhat unique to the Western tradition. And, it doesn't have that long of a history within the Western tradition, but the idea that we should not consider ourselves better than everybody else out of hand and actually keep a list or a tally of the things that make you better is new. And it has some really great things to it because I like the idea that anybody can be part of a society and not be restricted by their background. But the problem is that it leaves you open to groups to act as bad actors who believe that their group is superior. And it doesn't allow you to defend yourself that well, because what are you going to take as a stance? If you can't say that your group doesn't have the best ideas, then you literally concede the argument before the argument is even taken.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, ideas are one thing. I think race is another. And I think some people certainly just clump them together, right? They think, oh, Chinese ideas are the Chinese race, is the Chinese nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you're saying or no?
Well, no, that's definitely how you could construe it, because it's extremely hard to divide people from their culture and culture from the beliefs that predicate them, because they generated them. And this is another thing which a lot of people on the left don't like, but different cultural backgrounds lead to different outcomes in terms of technological development, philosophical development, social structure, what is okay in terms of how you are in relation to the law, in relation to your government. And a lot of these things can be tied to historical ethnic groups or even racial categories or racial groups, but most likely ethnic groups, right? So it becomes really tricky really fast, because it's like, okay, the right has gone too far when they start touting ethnic nationalism. It's like, but well, what if their ethnic group is the one that came up with the idea that helps everybody else?
Right. Well, and I think I was corrected on this earlier. Peterson says it would be ethnic superiority. And I still see a difference between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's clear which one comes first. And that's, like, I want to discuss this more with the people who are challenging me on the thought, because it was like, I can see how ethnic superiority and ethno-nationalism, that's very clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
My culture, my ethnicity is the best. So let's get rid of everyone who's not that, and let's not let anyone who isn't that in, right? I can see how that. I don't actually see. Well, and I could see how an ethno state can lead to ethno superiority, because you're like, if you are keeping people out, on, the question is on what basis, and then also even if the people keeping them out didn't necessarily believe they were superior, like say Richard Spencer has his way, right? He might not believe white people are superior. He just might believe that, like, I honestly do think that his view is, and others' view, so maybe I'm not saying this is the view of the people who were challenging me, but I think this is the view that they were helping me to see, is that you could support an ethno state not because of ethno superiority, but because there's evidence that works, that there's less conflict, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it would be a pragmatic reason to support it. But even if the people who implement it were thinking pragmatically, I can see how a lot of other people, or at least the next generation, would come to believe that their ethnicity is superior, right? Mm-hmm. So I can see how one can drive the other in either direction, but I can also see how they both can exist independently. Well, not at the same time. I don't know if they can exist independently simultaneously, but I know some people could have one without the other, and the other person can have the other without the one. And to that degree, it really makes it hard for me to understand what is too far. And the best I can do is to say either of those. So ethno-national or ethno-superiority, you've gone too far. That's the only way I can make sense of it.
I think then what we're looking for is a limiting factor. So I'm getting a bit of feedback there, JP. Are you getting it?
Nope, but I'll mute myself.
Okay. It's what is the limiting factor between the two? Because as we discussed earlier, the problem with defining ethnicity is it's really, really broad. It doesn't actually have to be completely racially motivated. And in fact, within racial groups, we can see people organizing themselves in terms of ethnicity because of the choices that they make. But we as outsiders might not be able to see it. Now, when it comes to ethno-nationalism versus ethno-superiority, I think the limiting factors have to be these. Who are we talking about when we're talking about the group? And second, who are we excluding? So you can have ethno-nationalism that actually incorporates people from many, many different backgrounds, but they are more civically inclined. So they all agree on the same civil structure, and they think it works well. But as soon as it becomes to the exclusion of people, or let's even say the problematization of other people who are not in your group, and your group is uniform and identifiably so, that's when it becomes superiority, and that's when it becomes extremely problematic, because you have limited the scope down to such a degree that it cannot accept other people within its purview.
Yeah, and it's not even, well, in that scenario, it's not even like you limited the scope. It's like you broaden the scope off of one very small attribute of the people you don't like. And what I mean by that, like, for example, we don't have a problem with Mexicans. Like, Trump doesn't have a problem with Mexicans nor Muslims. He has this problem with criminal Mexicans and Muslims. He actually doesn't even have a problem with Muslims. He has a problem with people from specific. He has a problem with certain countries that want to see us destroyed. And those countries just happen to be Muslim, right? And now if he was to ban all Muslims because of that, that would be stupid in my opinion. But if he was to ban people from those countries and then as a way to, as part of the process, he was racially profiling, to me, that's a different thing. You get what I'm saying? Like the difference between, like if we were in conflict right now with Israel, it would be silly to say no Jews can come to America. But maybe as Jews are entering America, you want to check if they're from Israel. And you're more likely to find somebody from Israel if you check all the people wearing yarmulkes than if you just check at random, right? The whole idea, if you're gonna racially profile, do it right, you know?
And it would also require, like, this will come back to bite us, I'm sure. But you also have to get into the nuance of what is the orientation of said people. Because there are Orthodox Jewish sects, as counterintuitive as this might seem, that don't believe Israel should exist as it exists now.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and this is just a hypothetical, but I'm glad you brought that up because it's like, that's what I'm trying to say. It's like I think there's a difference between using an attribute of an ethnic group as a heuristic to begin further vetting, I guess what I'm saying. Compare that to, oh, anybody with that attribute, you're just not allowed in, right? Mm-hmm. But the left is very sensitive to racism and stuff. So if you tried using it as a indication of something to start further vetting, they would be against that. But if you just banned all Jews, you know, or anybody who wore a yarmulke or something, like just some attribute of being Jewish, that would also be unacceptable. So I know we're on a different topic now, but I'm kind of interested in the difference between, you know, banning all of a certain kind of person versus banning all of a certain kind of person who also has this other sub-attribute that has this other sub-attribute. Does that make sense? So if you're a Muslim right now, because that's, well, I guess not anymore. We haven't heard a lot about ISIS or anything in a while, have we?
Yeah, because they've been
destroyed,
pretty badly beaten. They still exist, but the state, which was being fought, has pretty much been taken apart.
Wow. But my point is, like, it's hard to articulate. Like these, I think these things are much more complicated than most people are willing to admit.
Well, here's what I'd say to that. The problem becomes that both sides need to admit that they use parameters to try and suss out who is their ideal person or ideal group or not.
The left certainly does that. I'm a straight white male.
Yeah. But they also need to be called out when they, let's say, problematize the other side for making use of exactly the same tools, just with a group or a concept that they hold dear. So as soon as you say you cannot use the tools at hand because you're questioning our beliefs or our ideology, you're a bad actor.
Well, I would say it's a misuse of the tool. I would have no problem if the left had this view that straight white males were something, right? And they were using that as a, because they don't know me, right? A stranger walks up to me, they're like, "Oh, straight white," and they use it to like put me in a starting point. But then they vetted me further. I would say that's a great use of the tool, and that's exactly how I would use it. For me, it's a matter of, you're a straight white male. I now know everything I need to know about you, which is exactly what they don't want you to do when you come across, you know, a young black man in a hoodie, right? So at least in my particular case, I'm not convinced that I am exhibiting any kind of hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying you were accusing me of it. I'm just reflecting.
And that once again comes down to the problem of saying that there is a tool set which we use to justify our stance, but only we can use that tool set. And any other application of said tool set, even if it's exactly the same tool as we're using, is inherently wrong. Because then you presuppose that anyone opposite to you is automatically either evil, has some sort of alternate intention, and that's both poisoning the well, and it's also not being honest.
In my example, does it seem like I'm using that tool set and saying that others should not?
No, but what you're getting at is more so that you look at the tool set and go, hang on, if I use what you have, what you are presupposing, I don't even think you're using the tool. Because I can use it and come up with an entirely different answer to you, which is actually more justifiable. So you're claiming that you are using this tool and somehow it tells us something about the truth of reality, but you're not even using the tool that you say that you're using. And yet you question me when I actually use it properly.
I see, yeah. And I mean, there's an argument, well, because I could remove because that's, whether or not you're using it properly could be subjective, right? So we can remove that out of it. I'm more interested in people who are using it consistently, and I don't, right? Because I don't think, we're way off topic, but it's fine. I don't think the left uses it consistently. I'm not so sure the right does either. So to be less abstract about this, the tool being intersectionality or something, or just, how do we put it? Whatever, I don't know what you'd call the tool. Let's call it FooBar. FooBar is the tool that allows you to put people into groups and then treat them based on the group that they belong to, right? That it would be consistent if the left said, "Oh, racists use it, and so you know, like everybody can use it in that way." So, you know, the redneck who wants to see his daughter dating a black guy and ban her from it is the same as like the lefty who sees a straight white male and, you know, doesn't give him the job position, right? That would be one way to be consistent. Another way to be consistent would be the way I use it, I think, which is, I'm going to use these traits as a way to start you in a position in my head, because I got to categorize you somehow. I won't know how to interact with you if I don't. Otherwise, you're just, you know, like obviously you interact with a human differently than a dog. Well, you probably interact with, you know, off the bat, a straight white man differently than a gay black woman. I don't know. But as long as you are willing to vet them from there, and that they can change their impression that's in your brain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In a roundabout way, this is basically the principle of falsifiability.
Okay.
Meaning that you are willing to change your mind because, having gone through the process, your initial supposition doesn't appear to hold true.
Right, and I wouldn't even hold on to the initial supposition so strongly.
Yeah. You're not so heavily wed to it. So even though you approach a topic saying with a perspective on it, you do your best to approach it from a neutral, or let's say as close to a value neutral stance as you can, and let the process play itself out, and don't, let's say, gerrymander the process in some way. So the example of gerrymandering the process in some way would be saying, everybody's oppressive, men are always oppressive.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, now, when we actually run through the process that says it's not, then you turn around and say, well, actually it does. It's just that the process doesn't understand that men are oppressive. Because then you're not using the tool with any integrity, because you're not willing to be proven wrong. So how can we trust you, your interpretation of reality, when even the tools at hand which we have to decipher it, you're unwilling to use, let's say, with an open mind, and then you attack anyone who tries to use it from a more value neutral perspective. And in fact, you attack them twice as hard because they tried to be value neutral. And we could diverge into postmodernism and post-structuralism at that point.
Yeah. I don't know. It's all very interesting. Okay. So we're hitting close to time, and I had to move, so my battery's limited as well. So I'm just curious then. So your final verdict, where's your brain at right now? How do you know the left has gone too far? What's your
when they presuppose that their side can achieve a perfect state, and that questioning the possibility that a perfect state exists is considered heresy.
Sacrilege, yeah. And how do you know the right is too far? Same answer?
I think the right would have gone so far. Yeah, it would be the same answer for both.
And then what's an example of that we see on the left, and what's an example of that we see on the right?
Okay. An example on this would be the right, on left, is that the system itself is always oppressive. And by existing, the system is oppressive, and questioning that the system is oppressive just proves that you're an oppressive person. Okay.
Yeah.
On the right, we could do the same with extreme libertarianism. When libertarians say there should be no government structure because people can work out their problems on their own, because people are awesome, and if you question this, then clearly you're a part of the oppressive government structure.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And you would consider that the right, or would you consider that?
I would put that on the right.
Okay. Because I use a different axis when I think of libertarian, authoritarian. But I asked you, I didn't ask me, so.
But what would your take be on this there, JP?
Well, I'm still confused on the right. I do like the initial thing. I like the abstract version of your answer, which was when they feel they have an idea for a utopia. I would just add to it, and this is why the libertarian one doesn't fit for me. I would add to it the implicit or explicit use of force, right? I don't mean implicit use of force because that's weird, but the implicit or explicit indication that force would be needed to accomplish it. So the reason the libertarian view doesn't work for me, the one you said, is because if there was no government, yes, I get your point that like people hold this belief very strongly that like, oh, if there was no government, things would be great. And if you don't agree, then you're part of the oppressive whatever. I do not think that those guys are trying to force you into doing anything. They're just resisting ever having to be forced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure. Problem being with that, though, is that they would say they're being resisted being forced, but much like the ideal communist state, we've never had the ideal libertarian state. And what becomes problematic in both those cases is they're assuming a utopia, which has never managed to be brought about, and pointing that out, therefore, becomes heresy.
Define utopia, because when I hear the left describe their fantasy result, I do think that's a utopia. They think crime would be everything would be better, people would be happy, everybody would have money to spend, blah blah blah. Right? It's just like rainbows and unicorns. But when I hear the libertarian view, I don't hear utopia in the sense that everyone's going to be happy all the time and everything's going to be. I just hear you. If it's a utopia, it's in the context of freedom. So I think libertarians believe that there's still going to be crime and pain and agony and stuff. It's just that you're going to be responsible for it. And other people leading lives that give them heightened agony. Because, in a communist or in a society where everybody's forced to share everything, you share the riches and the woes in a way, right? Where I think in this libertarian society, you don't have to share in those things. So almost naturally, and it almost sounds pretty morbid, but the people who don't get their shit together suffer the most, right? So I don't think of that as a utopia, where the people in a communist or Marxist or socialist, whatever, utopia, even the people who don't have their shit together, the people who have their shit together the least, they do just as well as everyone else. And that's why for me, it's like I'm not feeling the utopia argument for the libertarians.
Sure, because it's not presupposing that everyone is going to be living on clouds and singing on rainbows, kind of thing. Utopian might be the incorrect term, but it seems to assume that there is an ideal state which occurs when people have maximized freedom in all things, right? And therefore, it, let's say, deifies the free market. It deifies the means of exchange and makes that sacrosanct, despite the fact that even in relatively free markets, and especially within our globalized world, there are bad actors within the market who would benefit, let's say, or who benefit from acting poorly. And the assumption that somehow people in general would be able to hold those things to account seems very short-sighted in a world where a company can then move to a different place, victimize those people, move to a different place, victimize those people. So I would say their utopia is in the deification of the market system, that somehow it would always be as just as possible based off of how resourceful people are. And I don't actually think that's the case.
And I feel inclined to defend it. And obviously I have a bias in that direction because these are my beliefs. But like they're more aligned with what I believe. But it would seem that in this society, all of the other societies could exist in voluntary voluntary subgroups of it. So, for example, a company is largely going to probably going to function like a mini socialistic government, right? In a lot of ways.
Well, I would say,
or communist government.
They would probably say it would operate more as a mini meritocracy, right?
Okay. But I mean, they would have like a group healthcare plan. They would have responsibility and duties. So people would give to the company and then they'd get something from the company. That wouldn't be equal unless that's the structure. But I'm just saying it wouldn't be. My point is that the company structure wouldn't be the government structure, is really what I'm getting at.
But
so that this government structure allows as many people who want to be part of a different structure to go join it.
So have you ever seen the movie RoboCop?
Long time ago, so I don't remember the plot.
Okay. RoboCop takes place in a world where essentially corporations operate as their own little nations, and that a corporation took over California and now runs it as if it was the government, because it is their state. They own the land, they own the people.
Right.
And so it actually operates as a land owned. Sorry, it operates as an entity that is both a corporate structure, but also, because not everyone in that area is part of the corporation, it also operates as the government.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the problem that I see with, once again, this idea that corporations could be trusted within a libertarian, let's say, nation, could be trusted not to suddenly turn into dictatorial governments with regards to people who may not be part of the companies, who either live in an area which they've bought, or with regards to employees who turn out to be largely replaceable. So I am not willing to be totally, let's say, agnostic towards the intentions of a corporation that operates under the idea that it wants to maximize profits, and how treatment of peoples within the corporate structure, as well as people who are not part of the corporation but might exist on areas that the corporation owns, would lead to an ideal state. But I would say a lot of libertarians and also anarcho-capitalists would argue that it would lead to the ideal state, or at least a better state, in terms of a meritocracy of what people can do and how they would provide for themselves and trade with one another. And once again, within that, they seem to deify the system without acknowledging that right now we have many corporations that actually seem to own places. If we go into South America, we can see a lot of this, and they treat people who are not employees or people who lived in an area which they then purchased in not terribly good ways.
Sure.
And I don't think that would go away under a purely libertarian system.
Yeah, I mean, I might not understand fully what a purely libertarian system means, but I imagine there's still the basic protections from government, which is like if an agent from a company tried to murder you, you would have protection from that. Right?
That's what happens in RoboCop. Essentially, the company is murdering people, but because they exist,
protect.
Well, because they exist within that company's sphere, the rights which the company extends are only enforced in so much as what is happening is seen publicly. Mm-hmm. So there's actually people being offed or persecuted, but they're just kept off the grid. And there aren't any human rights for these people to lean back on.
It's what mama doesn't know doesn't hurt her kind of thing. Like government doesn't see it, so they can't protect it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, but as technology advances, I made this point once, and I said it's ironic because more than ever, the technology we have today, if we were to implement communism, we could do it much more effectively and efficiently. Like it would work better now than it ever would have given our technology. But you could say the same about capitalism. You could say the same about pretty much any system. Technology would make any system work better today than 100 years ago. I do believe that. But that's why I lean more towards the free systems. And here's another thing. The way you're describing systems sounds like everything is a system. Even the lack of a system is a system, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, so I might be overgeneralizing the utility of the concept.
You know, one of my favorite quotes about atheism is because people like say, "Oh, well, atheism's a religion." It's like atheism is a religion, like baldness is a hair color, right? Do you get it? It's like baldness is not a hair color; it's the lack of hair. So atheism isn't a religion; it's ideally a lack of belief. But I can see the philosophical argument that that is a belief in itself. And just like yours, I could see the lack. Well, I don't know if you were making this argument, but it seemed in, intrinsic to the argument, which was that a lack of a system is a system itself, right? It's kind of like how the zero set is a set in mathematics, right?
Yes. And I don't know if I'm actually adding anything by saying this, but more so that, as you pointed out with technology, technology allows you to create systems which were not previously able to be created, right? And go about things in ways that previously weren't allowed to be done. But it also creates problems to go along with that, which might not be able to be anticipated.
Right.
The assumption that we will technology, or at least develop our way out of problems, is to ignore that with each new development, we create new problems.
That's true.
And so to presume a state where something will perfect us away from having problems in general is a utopian statement.
Well, I don't mean it would take us. For me, I'm not optimizing for. I'm optimizing for individuals to have more freedom and choice of their problems. I mean, or like their problems are their responsibility. What sucks is when, for me, what sucks is when we have to share. This is the reason I think people don't like communism, socialism, etc., is because you have to share everything you earn, so everything that's good, and what you get in return is everything that's bad, right? Because you're sharing that too. And it's like, in my utopia, if you want to call it that, you're allowing people to, the potential to create good is infinite, but so is the potential to create bad. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But so, you don't. But it's not intrinsic in the system that you share it.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that how you conceive of this, it doesn't. Sorry, its redeeming quality is that it doesn't inherently enforce a limitation on people. It leaves them to their own devices to pursue what they want to pursue, and that will lead to whatever outcome that person is well calibrated to achieve.
I'm not promising a great outcome, where something like communism is trying to promise a great outcome, and a common criticism of it is, well, what if we're all equal, but we're all poor? We're all dead, you know? And I think, like, obviously, if there was a system that was, everybody would have a fantastic life, which I do believe a system exists, and it's going to be in the future when we all can just plug into a computer and, you know, put some food in our wrist and then have whatever world we want, right? But we're quite a few years from that. But my point, I guess, is that with the libertarian system, if we're going to call it that, it's not a utopia, because you're not saying life's going to be great. You're just saying life's going to be free and what's the word I'm looking for?
Uninhibited?
Well,
or unhindered.
Life is, I don't want to see, that's what's tricky about it, because life is not uninhibited. Life is not unhindered. But it's not going to be inhibited and hindered by your government. And there are some hindrances, what's the word I'm looking for?
Hindrances.
There are some hindrances, if that's a word, that the government will actually protect you from, but only some. And that's, you know, if somebody's imprisoning you, or, you know, somebody's trying to murder you, stuff like that. Your right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or whatever. But outside that, it's just a free, you know, it's a sandbox. And if you don't want a sandbox, you can find a bunch of other people who don't want a sandbox, and some of them are going to want to lead something, and you can go have that, you know.
Yeah, I think the criticism with that, though, is essentially that would lead to self-selecting groups. Self-selecting groups tend to define themselves against other groups. Self-selecting groups tend to go to war with other groups. And so the idea that this system is somehow better versus it's a reset. So it's essentially saying, we don't like what's here, let's reset it.
Yeah, you're right. Because I've thought about this, especially with the anarchy thing. It's like literally what we have today sprung out of anarchy, if you think about it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because in anarchy, I can just walk up to you and kill you. And then your brother can come kill me. And then, then we start making agreements so that maybe we're not killing each other. Next thing you know, we have government again. It's like, so you're kind of making that same argument for the libertarian one, right?
Yeah, I would argue that what you're proposing is not a solution, but rather a reset of the system.
Yeah.
And the thing is, but what system is it going to lead to that's better in its genesis than the system that we have now?
Right. No, I get what you're saying. So if you actually ran the thought experiment, it would be a reset. We would be forming tribes that go against each other. We'd be hurting each other. Some super government might come in and try to protect that. But then to manage that, they're kind of encouraging agreements between the tribes. And now the tribes are agreeing to some super agreement. Next thing you know, you have states and federal government again.
Yeah, basically. Which might not be a bad thing, because once again, if we accept the premise that because we have better stuff now, if we were to try and reorganize society, then we might actually end up with better society, a better society, or more likely, better societies. That could be a good thing.
Right. We could wind up with a less restrictive version of what we have now, but a type of people that are able to function within it, because they have access to different things. Back when we were developing this stuff, people barely had access to water. If you set a reset and everybody, and plumbing is a thing and internet is a thing, like maybe we culturally wind up somewhere else in a few generations that's less restricted, possibly.
Yeah. But
there's no
the
way.
Assumption, once again, that the thing which I always want to problematize is that as a heuristic, we tend to end up with the idea that there will be a better system, singular. And it's like, at no point in our history have we ever had just one system for doing things. Yeah. And so whenever either side presupposes that they're going to end up in a state which makes for the better system, then they don't understand what reality is. And they're not allowing for inherent diversity, and also a diversity of how good of an outcome you can achieve.
So do you presuppose that what's best for us is a system of systems?
Yes.
Gone too far.
In the same way that it's like, if you ask somebody what is the best sauce or the best flavor, I would say there is no best flavor. There are best flavors, right? So there's clearly a differentiation between the ideal that there is one ideal state, and that's something I will always oppose, versus the fact that there are many states which can be more ideal.
Right. And I'm with you. I'm going to be facetious and pedantic here, but you could argue that a system of many systems is still one ideal state.
Absolutely. If you reduce it down to the base principles, absolutely. Yeah. But better to acknowledge.
I think when things are paradoxical, you can ignore them.
Ouch. So we basically spent 2.5 hours over nothing, eh?
No. I'm just saying, no. I'm not saying. I'm saying my criticism of it is contingent on a paradox, and therefore my criticism should be ignored, not your idea. I've heard recently somebody brought up in justifying violence. They said they brought up the tolerance paradox, and they said the only way to have a truly tolerant society is to be completely intolerant of intolerance. And I think in their mind it was very clever, and it justified being intolerant of intolerance. But in my mind, I see a paradox, and I think you're just thinking about it wrong. There's another way to think about it.
Yeah, because whose tolerances should you be intolerant of, and whose intolerances need toleration?
Right. And should I be tolerant of your intolerance of that intolerance that I didn't think? You get what I'm saying? Like,
Oh yeah. Well, we had a discussion about this. What was it? Last week.
Yeah. Well,
No.
you and I, yeah. We should just stream all our talks.
No, that'd be cool. But anything else there, JP?
Nope. My battery's down to a 7%. Oh, Adam. How's it going? I just noticed that Adam joined. We are wrapping up, so I don't know if you got to watch the whole thing or not, but the conversation kind of went recursive at the end there. But definitely check it out. And if you're not subscribed already, Adam, you should subscribe to my channel, and you should like it. Yeah, he says, "Damn it!" Right as I jump on. Yeah, sorry, man. But you know, Adam, if you're interested, I'd like to have you on the show sometime. You should let me know, because I think you and I have really great conversations. Maybe the three of us could try one. Actually, Duff, I have a proposal for you, which is I would love to host a conversation between you and another around a topic sometime, if you'd be down.
Oh, I'd totally be down for that. You'll be able to watch them kick my butt thoroughly and completely. But that's fun too.
Well, it doesn't have to be a debate. I just want to have a discussion about topics because, you know, you think, like, I've been doing these meetups and everybody in the meetup just thinks so differently. But it's the fact that we're all able to actually talk to each other that makes it fun, right?
Yeah, life is boring if not for diversity. Yeah. And diversity of opinion is the best diversity.
Diversity of opinion is the best. Okay, cool. And Adam would love to be on. Maybe I'll do an interview with Adam, and then I'll try to hook up a discussion between you two, because I think you two would actually get along real well.
Cool.
Sweet. Well, on that note, thank you for anybody who tuned in, anybody who watched it after the fact, and have a good night, Duff. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.